A dying man lay bleeding on the pristine linoleum, yet the arrogant billionaire only cared about his schedule. He sneered at her pastel scrubs. "Move over, sweetheart. You're just a clinic nurse." He never suspected the quiet woman holding the gauze once commanded the deadliest ghost unit in Fallujah. The torrential Seattle rain battered the reinforced glass of the Emerald Peak Medical Group, a high-end private urgent care facility nestled in the city's affluent tech district. It was 11:40 p.m. on a Tuesday, usually a quiet hour reserved for wealthy insomniacs with migraines or the occasional minor sports injury. Nora Hastings preferred the night shift. The silence was a heavy blanket that kept the memories at bay. At 34, Nora was a picture of clinical efficiency. Dressed in standard-issue seal blue scrubs, her dark hair pulled back into a severe no-nonsense bun, she projected a quiet, almost invisible demeanor. She was the triage nurse, the gatekeeper. To the doctors, she was reliable to a fault. To the patients, she was a comforting, albeit distant professional. No one asked about the faint, jagged scar that traced the line of her jawbone, and Nora never offered an explanation. The automatic doors violently hissed open, shattering the midnight lull. 3 men burst into the waiting room, bringing the cold storm and the metallic scent of copper inside with them. 2 of the men were built like brick walls, wearing tailored tactical suits that screamed private military contractor. Between them, they dragged a 3rd man whose expensive cashmere overcoat was soaked in dark arterial blood. "I need a doctor now," barked the man taking the lead. This was Garrett Winslow. Even covered in rain and someone else's blood, his arrogance was palpable. Garrett was the vice president of Praetorian Defense Group, a rapidly expanding private security firm that fancied itself the next Constellus or Blackwater. He carried himself with the unearned swagger of a man who wrote checks for violence, but rarely got his hands dirty. Nora moved instantly. She didn't flinch at the blood or the shouting. She grabbed a trauma gurney from the bay and kicked the brakes loose. "Get him on the bed. What happened?" "Hunting accident." Garrett snapped his eyes, darting around the empty lobby. "Where is the head physician? Get him out here." Nora ignored the demand, her eyes locked on the victim's chest. The blood was pulsing frothy and bright red. Sucking chest wound, her brain calculated instantly. Not a hunting rifle. High-velocity rounds, 5.56 at close range, maybe closer. "Room 3, move," Nora commanded, her voice dropping an octave, stripping away the gentle bedside manner she usually employed. Garrett scowled, visibly offended by her tone, but the 2 bodyguards, one of whom was a hulking former ranger named Hayes, complied, hoisting the dying man onto the gurney. They wheeled him into the bright fluorescent glare of Trauma Bay 3. "Dr. Gregory is on call, but he is currently stabilizing an anaphylactic patient in the back," Nora said, grabbing trauma shears. She sliced through the cashmere and the blood-soaked silk shirt with practiced robotic precision. "I'm taking point." "The hell you are?" Garrett stepped forward, grabbing Nora by the shoulder of her scrub jacket. His grip was tight, threatening. "This is a high-value VIP. You don't touch him, sweetheart. You page the damn doctor. We pay a premium for Emerald Peak, not for some glorified pill pusher." Nora didn't look at his hand. She looked directly into Garrett's eyes. Her gaze was completely devoid of fear, cold and vast, like a frozen ocean. "Let go of my scrubs," Nora said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried a sub-audible frequency of absolute authority that made Hayes the bodyguard subtly shift his weight. Garrett scoffed, dropping his hand, but stepping closer into her personal space. "Listen to me, Florence Nightingale. You're just a clinic nurse. Do not play hero. Just keep him breathing until my private medevac gets here. If he dies, I'll make sure you never work in this state again." Nora turned her back to him, completely dismissing the multimillionaire executive. The patient's breathing was growing shallow, his lips turning a terrifying shade of cyan. Tension, pneumothorax. Air was trapped in the pleural cavity, crushing his lungs and heart. "Hayes!" Nora barked, not looking up. "Grab that rolling cart. Bring it closer." Hayes blinked, caught off guard by the nurse knowing his name, or rather reading the small, customized name tape on his tactical vest, and instinctively obeyed before Garrett could stop him. Nora grabbed an Asherman chest seal from the cart, slapping it over the exit wound on the patient's back. Then she took a 14-gauge needle from the sterile drawer. Without a moment's hesitation, she located the second intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line on the patient's chest and drove the needle deep into the cavity. A sharp hiss of trapped air escaped. The patient gasped violently, his chest rising and falling as oxygen rushed back into his collapsing lung. Garrett watched slightly unnerved by the sheer violence and speed of her medical intervention. Most clinic nurses would be shaking, waiting for the attending physician. Nora's hands were steady as bedrock. "He's stable for transport, but he's going into hypovolemic shock," Nora stated, tossing the bloody needle into the sharps container. She began hanging 2 bags of O-negative blood, hooking up the IV lines with lightning speed. "Your hunting accident nicked the subclavian artery," Garrett sneered, recovering his bravado. "Like I said, just a nurse doing basic plumbing. Don't flatter yourself." Before Nora could reply, the clinic's front reinforced glass windows exploded inward. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire drowned out the storm outside. Shards of safety glass rained across the lobby like lethal confetti. Hayes immediately dropped to a knee, drawing his customized Glock 19, returning fire toward the shattered storefront. The second bodyguard wasn't as fast. A 3-round burst caught him in the throat, dropping him instantly in a spray of crimson. "Down!" Hayes roared, providing covering fire. Garrett shrieked, all his executive bravado evaporating in a millisecond. He scrambled backward, slipping on the pooling blood of his own employee, and curled into a fetal position behind a heavy medical supply cabinet. He was trembling violently, his hands covering his ears. Nora didn't scream. She didn't freeze. As the first shot rang out, her body acted on a muscle memory, buried so deep it bypassed conscious thought. She dropped to the floor, grabbing the brake release of the gurney, pulling the bleeding VIP down with her, so the thick metal frame of the bed acted as a ballistic shield. 3 shooters. Nora's mind assessed instantly, listening to the distinct firing patterns. Short controlled bursts, suppressed weapons, professional hit squad. They followed the blood trail. "We need to fall back," Hayes yelled over the gunfire. He dumped his empty magazine and slammed a fresh one home. "They're flanking the corridor. The back exit is wired to the magnetic lock system," Nora said, crawling toward Hayes while keeping her head below the fatal funnel of the doorway. "If the power is cut, it defaults to locked." As if on cue, the clinic plunged into darkness. The emergency backup lights flickered to life, casting an eerie blood-red glow over the trauma bay. "Damn it," Hayes cursed, firing 2 more rounds blindly down the hallway. "We're trapped in a fatal funnel. Mr. Winslow, we have to move." Garrett was hyperventilating. "Do something, your security, shoot them." Footsteps echoed from the lobby. heavy tactical boots crunching over the broken glass. They were advancing methodically. Nora looked at the bleeding VIP on the floor, then at the terrified billionaire cowering in the corner, and finally at Hayes, who was bleeding from a graze wound on his shoulder and rapidly running out of ammunition. They were going to die here. The realization didn't bring fear. It brought a cold, familiar clarity. The clinic nurse died in that moment. The ghost woke up. "Give me your secondary weapon," Nora demanded, locking eyes with Hayes. Hayes looked at her like she was insane. "What? No, stay down, lady." "They are employing a bounding overwatch," Nora said rapidly, her voice a sharp tactical whisper. "One is suppressing, two are advancing. In 30 seconds they will breach this room and frag the corners. Give me the damn gun, Corporal." Hayes froze. He hadn't told anyone he was a former Marine corporal. He looked at the intensity in her eyes, the eyes of someone who had seen far worse than a clinic shootout. Reluctantly, he unholstered his backup weapon, a compact Sig Sauer P365, and slid it across the linoleum. Nora caught it smoothly. She popped the magazine, checked the brass, slammed it back in, and racked the slide in one fluid, practiced motion. The blood from the VIP had soaked entirely through Nora's scrub jacket, making it heavy and restrictive. She needed full mobility. Without a second thought, Nora unzipped the blood-soaked seal blue jacket and let it drop to the floor, leaving her in a tight black sleeveless compression tank top. As she raised the weapon into a perfect high-ready retention stance, the emergency red lights illuminated her left arm. Hayes, kneeling just a few feet away, gasped. His eyes locked onto the skin of her left shoulder and bicep completely covered in dark, intricate ink. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a ledger of violence. At the top of her shoulder sat the insignia of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. But it wasn't a standard emblem. Intertwined with a winged dagger and a skull were the Grim Reaper scythes unique to Task Force Orange, the United States military's most highly classified intelligence and direct action element. Below the crest were exact GPS coordinates: the Korangal Valley, Fallujah, Raqqa. Surrounding the coordinates were 6 Roman numerals, each struck through with aligned memorials for fallen operators. But what made Hayes's blood run cold was the banner wrapping around her bicep. It read, "Sign Perry, Vanguard Actual, Vanguard Actual," a legendary myth in the private military sector. The call sign of the only female Tier 1 Special Mission Unit commander. A phantom who had orchestrated the dismantling of 3 different terror networks before vanishing from the grid entirely. Garrett, peering from behind the cabinet, saw it too. His eyes widened in absolute shock. The condescending sneer he had worn just minutes ago was entirely wiped from his face, replaced by a pale, breathless terror. "You," Garrett stammered, pointing a trembling finger at her arm. "You're—" Nora didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the doorway. Her breathing was steady, her heart rate dropping to a calculated calm. The frantic, scrambling clinic nurse was gone. Standing in her place was an apex predator. "Keep him quiet," Nora ordered Hayes, her voice dead of all emotion. "When I move, you suppress the right corner. I'll take the left." "Yes, ma'am," Hayes whispered automatically, his military conditioning snapping to attention in the presence of a superior officer. The shadow of the first breacher appeared on the wall outside the door. Nora shifted her weight, the Special Forces ink, flexing under the red emergency lights. The breacher spun into the doorway, rifle raised. He never even had time to pull the trigger. Nora pivoted, firing 2 suppressed shots in less than a second. Pop! Pop! The rounds hit the breacher dead in the center of his ballistic mask visor, shattering it. He crumpled backward into the hallway dead before he hit the ground. "Moving!" Nora shouted. Before the remaining 2 attackers could adjust their aim, the clinic nurse stepped out of the trauma bay and directly into the nightmare. The hallway of the Emerald Peak Medical Group, usually filled with the soft hum of air purifiers and the faint scent of sterile alcohol wipes, was instantly transformed into a claustrophobic theater of war. The red emergency lighting painted the corridor in jagged, terrifying shadows, and the thick stench of cordite and pulverized drywall hung heavy in the cold air. Nora stepped into the fatal funnel with a terrifying, unnatural grace. She did not sprint. Sprinting ruined accuracy and shattered situational awareness. Instead, she executed a flawless combat glide. Her knees slightly bent, her upper body entirely isolated from the movement of her legs. The compact Sig Sauer P365 was an extension of her eyeline. The 2 remaining mercenaries were highly trained. They did not panic when their point man's faceplate exploded. They immediately broke in opposite directions, attempting to establish an L-shaped ambush to catch whoever was stepping out of Trauma Bay 3 in a vicious crossfire. One moved toward the reception desk, taking cover behind the reinforced quartz counter. The other backed down the lateral corridor, raising a suppressed Heckler and Koch MP7 submachine gun. But they were reacting to the tactical tempo of a standard shootout. Nora dictated a completely different reality. She operated inside their OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. Before they could even orient themselves to her position, she had already decided who died first. Target priority, the highest volume of fire. Nora's internal monologue whispered a ghost of her training doctrine echoing in her mind. She snapped her sights to the mercenary with the MP7. He was 30 feet away, raising the muzzle, his finger finding the trigger guard. Nora didn't stop moving. She fired 3 shots on the move. Pop, pop, pop. The first round shattered the man's collarbone. The second perforated his throat. The third found the bridge of his nose. He dropped like a sack of wet cement, the submachine gun clattering uselessly against the polished linoleum floor, spraying a useless burst into the ceiling as his finger spasmed. Contact front. The third shooter roared from behind the reception desk. He blindly hoisted an M4 carbine over the quartz counter, unleashing a deafening, unsuppressed barrage of 5.56 millimeter rounds. The drywall beside Nora's head exploded, showering her in white gypsum dust. She didn't flinch. She dropped into a tactical crouch, sliding behind the thick structural pillar that separated the waiting room from the medical bays. The bullets chewed through the plaster, exposing the steel rebar beneath, but the pillar held firm. In Trauma Bay, 3 Hayes was watching the spectacle unfold through a shattered glass pane, his jaw slack. As a former Marine, he understood combat. He had seen intense firefights in Fallujah and Helmand Province. But what he was witnessing right now was not a firefight. It was an execution. It was the clinical, systematic dismantling of a hit squad by a single operator. The fluid economy of her motion, the absolute lack of hesitation, the terrifying precision, it was the hallmark of Tier 1 assets. It was Vanguard Actual. Garrett Winslow still curled into a pathetic, trembling ball on the floor beside the striker. Trauma Gurney was hyperventilating so hard he was beginning to see spots. The multi-millionaire executive who commanded boardrooms with an iron fist and ruthless intimidation had been reduced to a whimpering child. Every gunshot made him flinch violently, his expensive cashmere trousers now soaked in a mixture of the VIP's blood and his own cold sweat. Is she dead?" Garrett whimpered, looking up at Hayes with wide, terrified eyes. "Did they kill the nurse?" Hayes looked down at the billionaire, a look of profound disgust washing over his hardened features. "She's not a nurse, Mr. Winslow. We just unleashed the Grim Reaper." Out in the lobby, the mercenary behind the reception desk ceased firing. His magazine was empty. He dropped behind the counter, frantically scrambling to index a fresh magazine from his tactical vest. He was breathing heavily, sweat stinging his eyes. He thought he had her pinned. He thought the heavy suppressive fire would keep the target trapped behind the pillar. He thought wrong. Nora had used the deafening noise of his own gunfire to mask her footsteps. The moment his rifle clicked empty, she abandoned the cover of the pillar. She didn't approach the desk from the front. She flanked far right, slipping silently through the shattered remains of the glass entryway, stepping outside into the torrential Seattle rain for 3 seconds, and circling around to the side door of the reception enclosure. The mercenary slammed the fresh magazine into his M4, hitting the bolt catch with the palm of his hand. He took a deep breath, preparing to stand up and re-engage. He felt the cold circular steel of a gun barrel pressed gently against the base of his skull. The mercenary froze. The blood drained from his face. He didn't hear a sound, not a footstep, not a breath, just the icy kiss of the weapon. "Drop the magazine," Nora's voice whispered. It was calm, devoid of adrenaline, and utterly terrifying. "Eject the chambered round. Place the weapon on the floor. If your heart rate spikes, I will put a hollow point through your medulla oblongata." The mercenary swallowed hard. His hand shook as he pressed the magazine release. The heavy metal box hit the floor with a clatter. He pulled the charging handle, and a single brass cartridge spun out, pinging against the desk. He set the rifle down. "Hands behind your head. Interlace your fingers." He complied. Nora swiftly kicked the rifle out of reach. With her free hand, she reached into her tactical scrub pants, retrieved 2 heavy-duty plastic zip ties standard issue for mass casualty triage, but equally effective as restraints, and secured his wrists with bone-crushing tightness. She kicked the back of his knee, forcing him face down onto the floor, and pressed her boot into the space between his shoulder blades. The lobby fell deathly silent, save for the howling wind and the relentless pounding of the rain outside. Nora stood over the subdued attacker, the rain dripping from her dark hair, mixing with the gypsum dust on her black compression tank top. The intricate JSOC and Task Force orange tattoos on her left arm glistened under the emergency lights, a stark, terrifying testament to the ghost that had just laid waste to a professional hit squad. She did not lower the weapon. She kept her eyes on the shattered storefront, scanning for any secondary assault elements. 30 seconds passed. 60 seconds. The perimeter was clear. Nora engaged the safety on the Sig Sauer, lowered it to a low, ready position, and turned her back on the restrained mercenary. She walked deliberately back down the corridor, her boots crunching softly over the broken glass and spent brass. When Nora re-entered Trauma Bay 3, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the emergency generator finally kicked in, flooding the room in blinding, unforgiving white light. The room was a slaughterhouse of medical supplies, blood-soaked gauze, and shattered glass. In the center of the chaos, the VIP lay on the striker gurney, unconscious, but breathing steadily, the Asherman chest seal rising and falling with rhythmic stability. Hayes was standing at attention near the foot of the bed. He had holstered his weapon. As Nora walked in, covered in dust and rain, the terrifying black ink fully visible under the harsh lights, Hayes did something that made Garrett Winslow's jaw drop. The hulking, scarred military contractor snapped a crisp, perfectly executed salute. "Area secure, ma'am," Hayes said, his voice brimming with absolute, unquestioning reverence. Nora didn't acknowledge the salute directly, but she offered a curt, professional nod. She walked over to the stainless steel medical sink, turned on the tap, and began washing the blood and gunpowder residue from her hands. The water ran pink, swirling down the drain. "The perimeter is clear. I have one hostile restrained at the reception desk. 2 KIA. Nora reported, her tone completely neutral, as if she were giving a routine handover report to the next nursing shift. "Local law enforcement will arrive in approximately 4 minutes. The gunshot acoustics combined with the silent panic alarm under the desk guarantee a heavy SWAT response." Garrett Winslow finally managed to peel himself off the floor. His tailored suit was ruined. His slick, perfectly coiffed hair was an absolute mess. He looked at Nora, his eyes darting from the gun resting on the sink counter to the terrifying sign parry tattoo wrapping around her bicep. He was a man who bought power, who bought intimidation. But standing before Nora Hastings, he realized how profoundly fragile his manufactured authority truly was. What the hell are you?" Garrett stammered, his voice cracking, devoid of all its former arrogance. You're not a nurse." Nora dried her hands on a sterile paper towel. She turned to face him, leaning slightly against the steel counter. The cold, vast emptiness had returned to her eyes. "I am a licensed, registered nurse in the state of Washington, Mr. Winslow," Nora said evenly. "My credentials are up to date. Don't play games with me." Garrett shrieked, a brief flash of his old, entitled anger attempting to surface, though it sounded shrill and weak. "You just slaughtered an entire hit squad. You have JSOC Inc. My company hires Tier 1 operators. I know what that means." "Who are you?" Hayes stepped forward, placing a massive hand on Garrett's chest, physically shoving the billionaire back a step. "Mr. Winslow, I highly advise you to lower your voice and mind your tone. You work for me, Hayes," Garrett spat. "I work for Praetorian Defense Group," Hayes corrected coldly. "But right now, I am standing in the presence of Vanguard Actual. And if you disrespect her again, I will personally throw you through whatever glass is left in this building." Garrett paled, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked at Nora, the realization finally crushing him. He had belittled her. He had called her a glorified pill pusher. He had threatened to ruin her career, and she had just single-handedly saved his pathetic life. Nora ignored Garrett entirely. She walked back over to the gurney, picking up her stethoscope from the tray. She placed the earpieces in her ears and pressed the cold metal diaphragm to the VIP's chest, listening intently to the heart sounds. Heart rate is 110. Blood pressure is stabilizing. The hypovolemic shock is reversing. Nora stated, her voice reverting entirely to the clinical, detached tone of a medical professional. "He will survive the transport to Harborview Medical Center. Their trauma surgical team is the best in the Pacific Northwest." Sirens wailed in the distance, a rapidly approaching crescendo of red and blue lights, cutting through the dark, rainy Seattle night. Tires screeched outside as the first wave of Seattle Police Department cruisers swarmed the parking lot, followed closely by a heavy SWAT Bearcat. "They're going to ask questions," Garrett said nervously, looking toward the shattered lobby. "The police. They're going to want to know what happened here. They're going to arrest you for this." Nora pulled the stethoscope from her ears and draped it around her neck. She picked up her blood-soaked scrub jacket from the floor and calmly slid it back on, zipping it up just enough to conceal the black ink burying the ghost of Vanguard back beneath the pastel blue of the clinic nurse. "They won't ask me anything," Nora said softly. Before Garrett could ask what she meant, the back doors of the clinic swung open. A man in a sharp black raincoat stepped inside. He bypassed the medical bays entirely, flashing a heavy gold federal badge at the arriving police officers to keep them at bay. He walked directly into Trauma Bay 3. The federal agent didn't look at Garrett. He didn't look at Hayes or the bleeding VIP. He looked exclusively at Nora. "We caught the chatter on the wire 10 minutes ago." The agent said, his tone highly respectful. "A cleanup crew from Langley is already en route to handle the bodies and the restrained hostile. The narrative is a failed armed robbery. Security contractor Hayes neutralized the threat." Garrett's jaw hit the floor. "Wait, what? A federal cover-up for a nurse?" The agent finally looked at Garrett, a warning glaring in his eyes. "Mr. Winslow, you were never here. Your VIP had a hunting accident and was medevaxed from a private airstrip. If you ever breathe a word about this clinic, your company will lose every single federal defense contract it holds by tomorrow morning. Do you understand?" Garrett swallowed hard, nodding frantically. Yes, I understand." The agent turned back to Nora, offering a polite nod. "Is there anything else you need, Commander?" Nora picked up a clipboard from the end of the bed, carefully filling out the trauma intake forms. "Just ensure the cleaning crew is thorough. Dr. Gregory hates it when there's drywall dust on the monitors." "Understood," the agent said, turning on his heel and marching out into the lobby to coordinate the cover-up. The SWAT team flooded the building, shouting orders completely, ignoring the quiet nurse in the corner writing on her clipboard. EMTs rushed in behind them, taking control of the Stryker gurney, preparing the VIP for immediate transport to Harborview. Garrett was escorted out by Hayes, flanked by heavily armed police. Just before he stepped out into the rain, Garrett paused. He looked back over his shoulder at the triage bay. Nora Hastings was standing by the sink, calmly restocking sterile gauze into the transparent plastic bins. She looked completely ordinary, invisible, just a clinic nurse working the graveyard shift. But Garrett knew the truth. Beneath that pastel blue jacket lived a monster that hunted in the dark, a phantom that had spared his life. Not because he was wealthy or important, but simply because she had sworn an oath to do no harm. Garrett shuddered, pulling his ruined cashmere coat tight around his shoulders, and walked out into the storm, forever haunted by the terrifying silence of the woman who held the gauze. Did you expect that explosive twist? Nora proved that true power doesn't need a tailored suit or a loud voice. Sometimes the deadliest forces wear pastel scrubs and operate in the shadows. If this adrenaline-pumping story of hidden identities, tactical brilliance, and shattered arrogance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this video with your friends who love a badass hero, and make sure to subscribe for more thrilling action-packed stories